Sheila Davalloo. And if you have never heard of Sheila Davalloo before, that actually makes me pretty happy, and that is only because I really do try hard to not cover cases that are really, really well known already. The only one that I have done was the Jodi Arias, but that actually wasn't her case. That was just the manifesto that Jodi wrote when she was in prison. There have been a couple of people leaving comments underneath that Jodi Arias one, saying things like, "This case is tired," or "Everybody already knows about this one, move on," things like that. And I get kind of frustrated because it says right on there, Jodi Arias manifesto. I mean, okay, but I just end up deleting any kind of ornery comments and just move along. It doesn't really affect me all that much, believe me. So, as I was saying, I do try to cover cases that are not well known, and this one here happened. It's not very recent, but it's not too old either. It happened in 2003, and there was a book put out about this case that I read a few years back, and I was really impressed with the author's capability to stick to a timeline that wasn't very complicated, because this case can be complicated. So I figured I would kind of use the same kind of direction that this author did, but then I realized that would mean that I would have to read the book all over again, and I did not want to do that. So I researched and I researched and I researched, and I got super frustrated because there were so many inconsistencies in a lot of what I was reading. And then I happened upon this one website, which is escaping my mind at the moment, but I will link it in my description so you can see where I got this information from. So, as I said, this is about Sheila Davalloo, and the case begins in the spring of 2003 with Sheila, and Sheila was married to a man named Paul Christos, and Sheila and Paul were very much focused on their careers. Paul was working on his doctorate, and he spent a considerable amount of time studying. Paul and Sheila, they were both very much in love at first, but they started to slowly grow apart. Their schedules weren't exactly syncing up, and they really never saw each other all that much. And as I said, that's because Paul was deeply involved in getting his doctorate, so he was really involved in his research. And at home, Paul was having issues with Sheila. They were just not connected, and they weren't communicating. There was an emotional disconnect between the pair of them, and they had hardly saw one another. The she tells him it will allow them to reconnect not only emotionally but physically as well. And once Paul heard this, he was all ears. Paul was just really pretty frustrated with Sheila because it seemed like the only thing Sheila ever wanted to talk about was her work drama. I feel like I can so much relate to that. I tend to, I'm pretty good actually about keeping my work drama separate from my personal life, but I do sometimes get overwhelmed and I do tend to talk about it sometimes. So Paul was just super frustrated with the only thing Sheila ever really talking about, as I said, was her work drama. Whenever they had their rare moments to spend with one another, and I'm talking about when they ate dinner together, which was not common, but when they did eat dinner together, or if they did laundry together, or just doing dishes or running errands, whatever it may be that they did get to spend a little time with one another, all Sheila would talk about is this love triangle that was going on at work. So this love triangle involved what she would tell Paul, that there was a guy at work who was engaged to another woman at work, and these co-workers' names were Anna and Jack, and Jack was engaged to Anna, but Jack was messing around on Anna with a woman named Melissa, and now Melissa is Sheila's friend. So let me just say that again, just in case that's confusing. It's actually pretty simple if you just break it down real easily. So Sheila has these co-workers at work, and there's 3 of them, and she's friends with one of them named Melissa. Now these other co-workers are Jack and Anna, and they're engaged, but Jack is cheating on Anna with this Melissa, who happens to be Sheila's friend. Believe me, when I was reading this book, I was like, what? I had to read that like 10 times. So, Sheila, she would constantly be asking Paul for advice about this love triangle. She told him that she valued his opinion, and whatever advice that Paul would give her, she says that she would pass that on to her friend Melissa in order to help her. Sheila became so obsessed with these people at work and their drama, so much so that she even went as far as to help Melissa stalk Anna, and she used a pair of Paul's night vision goggles to do it. She also ordered listening devices so she could spy on them at work, and she ordered a lockpick set, and she practiced on their back patio door, telling Paul that she wanted to break into Anna's apartment. And Paul would tell her, look, it's really a bad idea. You'll get into a Sheila was communicating with him at all. Paul wasn't the only person that Sheila was telling this drama to. She was also seeing a therapist at the time, and she would tell this therapist all about it too. But she wasn't exactly telling the whole truth. But we'll get into that later. Okay, so now this game that Sheila was about to tell Paul about, it seemed to Paul to be a last-ditch effort to bring them closer together and to heal their marriage and maybe even connect them physically as well. It didn't help though that they had begun sleeping in separate rooms because they fought over every little thing and really seemed to be annoyed about each other's existence. Been there? Okay, so now we're back at dinner where Sheila is talking about this game that she heard about. She's about to explain to Paul how this game works. So Sheila is telling Paul about how she feels them drifting apart emotionally and wants to try to reconnect. You know, as I said, she said the game will help, and she begins to explain the rules. So the rules are, she blindfolds him and ties him to a chair, and then she takes objects from around the house and she rubs these objects on his skin, and then he tries to guess what they are. And then of course, after he guesses the objects, then, you know, he will blindfold and handcuff Sheila and do the same thing. So Paul agrees. He's all in. He would do just about anything at this point to just feel his wife near him. One thing that I do want to explain here is Paul, he once wanted to be an FBI agent, and because of that, he had built a small collection of FBI gear, and that included the handcuffs but also the night vision goggles. So if you were wondering, like I was, why did Paul have handcuffs and night vision goggles, that's why. Okay, so now they're about to play this game, and they go into the bedroom, and Sheila wanted to go first, so Paul handcuffed and blindfolded her. He then grabbed some random objects from around the house to rub against her, and Sheila is feeling super frustrated because she wasn't guessing many of the items correctly, and Sheila does not like to lose. She does not like to be second. That will reveal itself later on in this story. So now, before I get into how this game they were playing plays out, I want to tell you guys some background information on Sheila. Now, I realize with true crime there seems to be this blueprint or template, so to speak, when it comes to giving a background information on the relevant people in the stories, and I am of the mind that it's so super important to humanize these people, and I really do try my hardest to do that. But sometimes some of the details, they aren't really pertinent, so I'm going to give you some background information Sheila is obviously married to Paul, and they live in Pleasantville, New York. And Sheila works at a pharmaceutical company called Purdue Pharma, and that is located in Stamford, Connecticut. So even though she was living in New York and her work is in Connecticut, her commute was only about an hour, depending on traffic. She was 33 years old, and she and her family were of Iranian descent, and her family had emigrated to the States in the mid-1970s when Sheila was just a young child. Sheila was considered very successful. She had a degree in biochemistry, and she worked as a research scientist for the company, so she made a very good salary. So when Sheila was in college, that is when she met her husband Paul, and they started to date. And not long after, she was in love and got engaged. But what Paul didn't know was that Sheila was already married. So now, Sheila had grown up in a very strict family, and she claims that it's one of the reasons for her first marriage. The man she first married was Iranian, and he was much older than Sheila, and Sheila told Paul that it was an arranged marriage, and it's what the family wanted, and it was expected of her, so that's why she got married. Sheila's parents were very, very smart. They were very well educated, and they lived by their culture. And Sheila had, from everything I've ever read, I've never read anything to refute this. Sheila had a really good life growing up, even though her family was strict. They gave her the tools to have a great life. They wanted her to achieve great things in life because they knew she was smart, and anything less in their eyes would be a waste. So because Sheila claimed that her marriage was an arranged marriage, she promised that she would divorce that man so that she and Paul could get married. And she did. But at first, she kept her secret from Paul for quite a bit of time. On weekends, Sheila would kick Paul out of the house and send him to a hotel. And she would say that was the reasons for that were twofold. Number one, it was because he was so immersed in his research and working on his doctorate. She said it would allow him the peace and quiet to do that. But also, according to Sheila, she had a brother who was a schizophrenic, and Sheila said that her brother did not know that she was married, and she said that her brother would be very jealous and he just would not take it well. So in order to bring that brother over to their house, she had to get rid of Paul, and in doing that, she always had Paul help her get rid of any evidence that she and Paul were married and living together. she would tell Paul that if her brother found out that she had a husband, that he would not react well. So even though Paul and Sheila had been married for quite some time at this point, Sheila had not yet told her family, specifically her schizophrenic brother. She kept stringing Paul along, saying that when the time was right, she would tell her brother about their marriage, but because he wasn't ready to know yet, her brother needed to be kept in the dark. So this meant that every weekend, Paul left to stay in a hotel, and he had to take every sock, every personal toiletry, any single thing that could make someone think that there was another person living in the apartment with Sheila. But even though it was a pain in the ass, Paul pretty much welcomed the opportunity to focus on his schoolwork. He and Sheila, they had been having, as I already said, a sort of intimate disconnect, and he was always busy with studying, so weekend after weekend he just worked on his dissertation, thankful to have that time. Okay, now I'm going to jump back to this game that they were playing with these blindfolds. So now, after Paul removed the handcuffs from Sheila, Sheila blindfolded Paul and she laid him flat on his back with a pillow under his head, and she straddles him and she handcuffs his hands to the rung of the chair. So the way he was laying was his hands were stretched above his head, so they weren't usable. And so then Sheila starts rubbing these objects all over his body, like everywhere, and Paul actually does a really good job of guessing what these objects are. And Sheila, as I said, she does not like to lose. She gets super frustrated and she tells Paul, okay, well, you're doing so well here, so now I want to make this a little more difficult. So she said, I'm going into the other room just for a second to grab some other objects. So she says she'll be right back. So then she comes back in, and Paul, it was weird because you know how when you can feel somebody's presence, sometimes you can feel if somebody's watching you. Well, Paul did not hear Sheila come into the room, but he felt her presence right there, right in front of him. And she's not saying anything or doing anything. So he's like, Sheila, what are you doing? And she doesn't say a thing. And he's like, Sheila, I can feel you right in front of me. What are you doing? And then all of a sudden, Paul feels this huge thud in his chest. So not knowing what it was, and before he could even think about what it was, he feels that thud again. It was like feeling a heavy object being dropped on his chest. So he starts feeling very off and very weird, and then realizes that he's feeling blood coming from his chest, and he has no idea feeling more blood just pouring from his chest. So he asks Sheila what it was. What did she do? And she tells him, I don't know. She says that she went into the other room to get a candle. They had this candle in the kitchen, one of those like Yankee Candle type deals. And she says when she got it that she came into the room and she tripped and fell, and that the candle must have went into him somehow. And Paul is thinking, even with all of this blood coming out of him, Paul is thinking, wait a minute, I didn't even hear her trip and fall. What is she talking about? So anyway, he tells Sheila to get the blindfold off of him. And he's just sitting and feeling dizzy, which at that point, he actually looks down. Because remember, Sheila now only just took that blindfold off of him. And he's covered in blood all over his shirt, just bleeding very heavily. And he tells Sheila to call 911. He wants an ambulance because he's so dizzy and he feels like he could be nodding out. But Sheila couldn't take the handcuffs off of him because she couldn't find the keys. Now, Paul had just had her handcuffed, and when he had to get the key to get them off of her, he specifically remembered putting that key right next to the table that was right next to Sheila. And he tells Sheila, look, I just took them off of you. It should be right there on the table, but neither one of them see the keys. So that's just another odd thing. Also, Sheila really wasn't acting in this frantic, kind of hurried manner that I guess you would expect a wife to be doing. But she's not. She's just nonchalantly looking around for the keys and acting as if like it's just another day. So finally, Paul tells Sheila to break the chair so that he could at least be detached from it. Even if he's still handcuffed, he just wanted to be free from the chair. And so then Sheila breaks it. So now Paul is bleeding even more now, and he's realizing how much pain he's in. His entire torso was throbbing with this incredible pain, and his dogs even come into the room and they start circling around Paul, and these dogs start acting frantic, very panicky. So Paul is begging Sheila to just call 911. So Sheila grabs her mobile phone and she dials 911. And according to Sheila, she tells 911 that she needs an ambulance as quickly as possible. Then 15 minutes go by and there's still no sign of any ambulance, so Paul tells Sheila to call again, and this time he hears her speak to the operator, and he hears her asking asks Sheila to hand him the phone, but she wouldn't because she told Paul that dispatch suggested that he remain flat on the ground, and she tells him that they didn't want to speak to him. She says that the ambulance would be there in another 1/2 of 1 hour, and then she hangs up. So now time is going by, the 1/2 of 1 hour goes by, and there's still no ambulance, and Paul is just bleeding all over everything. So he crawls to the couch and he tells Sheila she's going to have to take him to the hospital because they're not coming. So Sheila agrees, and she gets Paul into the car in the back seat, and she speeds off to the emergency room, which is really close by. It's about 10 minutes away. Now, this emergency room that they chose to drive to was the medical center that both she and Paul were very familiar with, and that's because Sheila's mother had been a nurse there for almost 20 years, and Sheila's brother, the one who has schizophrenia, he was held in the psychiatric unit for a period of time there, but mostly both she and Paul had attended graduate school there. They should have gotten to the emergency room in under 10 minutes, but Sheila, as she was driving closer to the hospital, she was acting like she was lost, and she pulled into the wrong parking lot. So Sheila pulls into the parking lot and she goes right by the emergency room, and she pulls in the back of the hospital parking lot. Then she gets out of the car and she walks over to the door where Paul is at, and she opens it, and Paul is now losing consciousness. He's nodding in and out, and then he sees that Sheila has a knife in her hands and she's going to stab him. It is at that point when he realizes that it wasn't a candle that was making him bleed, and he now knows that it was this knife that Sheila is holding. So Paul is able to fight her off, but he's in and out, and he knows that he could pass out at any second. So as that is going on, there are a couple of orderlies that are outside of the emergency room, and they hear them fighting. And when Sheila realizes that these orderlies are about to head over there, she drags Paul to this embankment, and she hops in the car and she takes off. These orderlies bring Paul into the hospital, and he's dying. One of Sheila's stabs had sliced an artery going into Paul's heart, which is an injury that was fatal if left unattended for too long. Sheila, the entire time, was stalling Paul of getting any help so that he would die. So Paul is now near death, and he goes through surgery, and thankfully he comes out alive. Now after that happens, a detective shows up, and this woman is like a superhero. She reminds me of, I don't remember the name of the detective up. Her name is Allison Carpentier, and she starts to question Paul about what happened, and he tells her that his wife tried to kill him by stabbing him, and he tells her about the game that they were playing at the house and how she tried to stab him there and in the parking lot at the hospital. So now this detective, she goes to find Sheila, and she does, and she interviews her. So now, right off the bat, Sheila was telling investigators lies about what happened that night. Sheila claimed that Paul had arrived home and he was already injured, and that he had asked her to look at the wounds. Well, the thing is that Sheila thought that she was the only one that was giving information about what happened to Paul. And that's because the detective was giving off the vibe, or the impression, I guess, that Paul had died. So of course, Sheila thinks that at this point she can say whatever she wants because she's the only one with a side to the story. So Sheila's story to the detective is that she was at home and she was playing with her dog and Paul walked in. She says that Paul went into the bedroom and he laid down on the floor, and then he asked Sheila to look at his wounds to see if he was bleeding or not. And so Sheila explained that she gets nauseous if she sees blood, but she said even though she still looks, and she tells Paul that the wounds aren't really that bad. He wants to know, how deep are they? And Sheila tells them they're not deep, and she says she asks Paul if he needs anything, and he tells her that he wants to go to the hospital. So she says that she drives him there and says that she couldn't find the emergency room, so she stopped the car, left Paul, and went to ask someone where the emergency room was. Now, remember, Paul was conscious, and he told investigators exactly what happened, that Sheila had stabbed him in their home and attempted to kill him in the parking lot. The interrogating officer knew that the story that Sheila was saying was a complete lie. There were quite a few hiccups, if you will, in Sheila's plan, and one of them was that even if Paul had actually died, there were witnesses in the parking lot of that hospital that could attest to Paul's screams at Sheila to get away from him. So this detective wants to know why. Why did Sheila not tell any of the people that she saw at that hospital in the parking lot that she needed help? And Sheila claims that it was because Paul had asked her not to leave him alone. But remember, she had already said that when she pulled in, she had parked the car and left to find someone to ask where the emergency room was. So that was just another discrepancy. But Paul never asked Sheila to stay by his side, and she did not speak with any witnesses. I'm not sure if I already told you that part where she said to the investigator that his side. I'm not sure if I had mentioned that already, but if I did, I apologize. So now, the detective tells Sheila that investigators had a knife and they planned to check for fingerprints. And she tells Sheila that she knows about the game that she and Paul were playing. So, in doing that, she's letting Sheila realize that you can't lie anymore. Well, Sheila had a couple of different scenarios that she was trying to pull off on the investigator. She was even going as far as saying that this game that they played involved a knife and that Paul must have fell on it. The detective told Sheila that the wounds are not consistent with her story and that none of what Sheila was telling her was making any sense whatsoever. So, remember when she made those 911 calls? Well, Paul had claimed that he saw Sheila call 911, but there was no record of her call, and she delayed driving him to the hospital and ultimately drove to the wrong location despite her knowing exactly where it was. And by the time Sheila had stabbed Paul the last time, Paul realized that all of this was intentional. So according to investigators, Paul's recollection of the events were honest and reliable. Now, Sheila did in fact make some phone calls that night, but she had no intention of contacting anyone that could help Paul. The reason that 911 dispatch did not keep Sheila on the line is because Sheila never called 911. Both times Sheila had faked a phone conversation. When the investigators checked Sheila's phone to see who she had been in contact with, they found one phone number that was showing up multiple times. They start to go through Sheila's phone and they realized that she never called 911. She used her own mobile phone, but there's no 911 call on that particular phone. They noticed that Sheila was getting calls all throughout that same day into that evening, and that number, they traced it back to a man named Nelson Sessler, and Nelson lived in Stamford, Connecticut. So now this detective needs to get in touch with Nelson, and they tried a number of times to call Nelson just to get in touch with him to ask him questions, and she's not getting him, he's not answering. So the detective decides to drive to Stamford to talk to Nelson. So she drives there, and she gets there and she knocks on Nelson's door and nobody answers. A landlady ends up coming out and she asks the detective what she wants and who is she looking for, and the detective tells her that she's looking for a man named Nelson Sessler because she wants to ask him some questions about a case that she believes he could be involved in another county. The landlady tells the detective that the only case she knows about that Nelson is being questioned about is for the murder that took place in Stamford, not Westchester County, which is where Sheila's case is taking place. But the detective has no idea what this landlady is talking about. She does not know anything about a murder that Nelson may or may not be involved with. The landlady tells her that Nelson's girlfriend was murdered 6 months prior. So now the detective goes over to Stamford Police Department and tells them that she thinks she has some information for them. Okay, now, remember how Sheila was telling her therapist about the love triangle at work? Well, she was not talking about it because she was seeking advice from this therapist. She was actually indirectly telling Paul and the therapist about her own affair with a co-worker. So now, in this point of the story, when they talk about people doing things like this, Sheila is deemed kind of like a typical psychopath, where typical psychopaths have a need for stimulation. They need a lot of it, and there are these different characteristics of the psychopath, and one of the top ones is the need for stimulation, along with sexual promiscuity and manipulation. So Sheila is getting off on describing her own affair to her husband. If she thinks that she's actually pulling one over on him, it gives the meaning of her affair that she's having more of an impact. It gives it more meaning. So, just a little bit into Sheila Davalloo. Now, all of the weekends that Paul went to the hotel, remember he had to pick up his life and move everything to the hotel. When that was happening, Sheila was actually having an affair. She wasn't innocently visiting with her brother. When Sheila would go on weekend ski trips and these other out-of-town trips, she was actually cheating on her husband. So this worked out perfectly for Sheila because Paul had no idea what was going on, and her lover had no reason to believe that Sheila was married or even in another relationship. Okay, now we're going to put a pin in what is happening with Sheila and Paul for a bit, and I'm going to be talking about this man, Nelson Sussler. Remember, he is the man that the detective who was investigating what happened to Paul found on Sheila's mobile phone records. So, 4 months prior to the attempted murder of Paul, Nelson arrives at his fiance's apartment after work, which is in Connecticut, and police officer, and he asked him if he could get through. But the officer felt like maybe this is just an impatient tenant, and he tells Nelson that it is a crime scene and that he has to wait. So Nelson tries calling his fiancée, whose name is Annalisa, but he wasn't able to get through. He then asked the officer again if he could get through, and this time he ends up telling the officer that it was his fiancée's apartment that they have cordoned off, and that he could not get her on the phone. So now I'm going to tell you about his fiancée, Annalisa. So her name was Anna Lisa Raymundo, and she was a beautiful Filipino woman, and she was 32 years old. Annalisa's parents were both very successful doctors, and she had such a wonderful, close relationship with them, and she would call her mom twice a day, every day. She never missed calling her mom twice a day, which is so sweet. And her parents would come and visit her quite often, and her dad was super helpful, where he would help her clean up around the house, and her family was just very tight knit. Her parents and siblings, they all played a very important role in Annalisa's life. So Annalisa had this wonderful, infectious personality. She was intelligent, she was charming, she was well educated, she had a doctorate. I don't know if I just said her parents were both doctors as well. She was quiet, and yeah, she was dating Nelson. So Nelson, he worked also for Purdue Pharma, and Nelson was also very well educated. Annalisa, she very much wanted to be a mother and have a husband and just have that nice, I guess, American dream. And as I said, she was super intelligent, and she lived in this gorgeous luxury waterfront condominium. So even though Annalisa came from privilege, she actually ended up earning everything she had herself through hard work, except for the condo that she lived in. That condo that she lived in was actually bought by her parents because they were so proud of her and through her hard work. But in a sense, I feel like I'm going to stay true to what I just said, that she earned everything she had through hard work. Even if her parents bought her that condo, I feel like she got that because she worked so hard. So what else do I want to say about Annalisa? Oh, okay, so Annalisa graduated from Harvard with her undergrad, and she got her master's degree at Columbia University. So Annalisa landed a job that, I don't know if I mentioned that already, but she was working at Purdue Pharma, and that is headquartered in Stamford, Connecticut. I think I already might have mentioned that. So Annalisa's salary at Purdue, it allowed her to afford to continue living in that condo that her parents fees that we all have to pay out. And the place where she lived, everybody was very wealthy. People owned boats and yachts, and this place where she lived, it was a gated community, and it was called Palmer Landing. In the late fall of 2000, when it was early in her career, Annalisa met Nelson. They were both pretty new to Purdue Pharma, and when they met one another, they immediately became friends, and then slowly that friendship turned into casual dating, and Annalisa was just over the moon about Nelson. Annalisa had this image of a person that she wanted as a life partner, and at first it seemed that Nelson fit that mold perfectly. Nelson was this kind of overachiever type of guy. He was tall, he was considered good looking by, I guess, most women, and he also had a very, very good job with Purdue Pharma. Nelson lived not very far from Annalisa in Stamford. He lived in an apartment complex where he stayed with a couple of other guys. He had roommates, but he spent a lot of time over at Annalisa's, and he kept most of his things at her place, and he also spent 3 to 4 nights a week there. Annalisa was really hoping to get married and have children with Nelson. So they decided, Annalisa and Nelson decided to keep their relationship quiet among their colleagues because they just didn't want any awkwardness to happen with their relationship. But despite their secrecy towards the outside world and their co-workers, their relationship still moved to a very intimate kind of a direction. When Nelson went to a wedding with Annalisa, it was Annalisa's sister who was getting married in Michigan, and when Nelson went with Annalisa there, it was at that time that Annalisa had introduced Nelson to her family, which was this really large, extended family. Throughout the beginning of their relationship, Annalisa had this little voice in the back of her mind that would warn her that she should tread lightly when it came to trusting Nelson. She was continually worried that Nelson was afraid to commit. It wavered back and forth, and it sent her mixed signals about wanting to be together long term. And that was even after Nelson began staying with her on a nightly basis. So in order to kind of, I guess, ease her mind, lessen her anxieties, Nelson made sure to wine and dine Annalisa, and he told her all of the things that she wanted to hear. Nelson gave the impression to Annalisa and her family that he was the man that Annalisa was going to marry. Now, about 1 month after the wedding that Annalisa brought Nelson to, they decided that they wanted to make their relationship a so sorry. That is my neighbor with his very loud car. I don't understand why this guy just does not get his car fixed. Interestingly enough, he's a doctor who lives next door, but yet, yeah. And he's not like this young doctor, he's like an older one. So I feel like he probably maybe still has student loans. I don't know. But get your damn car fixed. Okay, sorry. Where was I now? God, I hate when that happens. Okay, I think I was saying the night that Nelson and Annalisa were going to tell their friends about the fact that they were dating. Their friends were at the restaurant waiting for them, and they were supposed to be there. I want to say they were supposed to be there at 7, and so all of the friends are sitting around and they're waiting, and they waited about 10 minutes, and then 10 minutes turned to 1/2 of 1 hour, and they ended up calling Annalisa's phone at her condo at 7:30, which, yeah, that was actually, it was an hour after they agreed to meet at the restaurant, so it was at 6:30 they were supposed to meet, and they end up not getting an answer, so they left a voicemail, and they called again at 8, and they left another voicemail. So Annalisa had a friend named Christine, and Christine figured that if she didn't answer her home phone, that she must be on the way over. So they just waited a little more, and when they did not get there, when they did not arrive, the entire group, they thought it was a little odd, but they really weren't that worried. Christine suggested that they stop at Annalisa's condo to see if she was home, but they ended up ultimately deciding against it, and they just all left. Collectively, though, the entire group had called Annalisa's phone over 25 times during the course of the night, trying to get an answer. Well, earlier that same day, so before Annalisa and Nelson were supposed to go to dinner, there was a 911 call that came into dispatch from near Palmer Landing, which is where Annalisa lived. And the caller said that a guy had attacked her neighbor. She said that she saw a guy go into the neighbor's apartment, which was at 123 Harbor View, and dispatch asks her if she knows the neighbor's name, and the caller says that she doesn't know the neighbor's name. She only knows that the neighbor lives at 105, and that a guy went in and attacked her neighbor. So when dispatch asks what the man looks like, she says that she doesn't know. She only heard yelling, and then the caller hangs up. So after she hangs up, dispatch realizes that, okay, well, maybe this is a distant neighbor, but in any case, she gave the wrong address. Annalisa lived at 123 Harbor Drive, apartment 105, not Harbor View. But despite the confusion, police were dispatched to the area immediately. Now, Nelson shows up at the condo around 5:30 because remember, he and Annalisa were supposed to be going to dinner that night. So when Nelson gets there, there's a mobile crime scene van in front of Annalisa's door, and there are police just crawling everywhere. And there is crime scene tape set up, and he sees police going in and out of Annalisa's door. But before Nelson arrived, the two police officers that were first on the scene, they get to the Palmer Landing parking lot and they climb up the steps to Annalisa's door, and they knock on it, and they're just expecting to interrupt a domestic dispute. So when they get no answer, they ring the doorbell and they wait, but still they didn't hear anything. So they tried the doorknob and it was unlocked. So they push open the door and they announce their presence, but still there was no answer. They then push the door open a little further and immediately notice that the apartment is in complete disarray. According to Nelson, that apartment was always very neat, very tidy, because Annalisa spent a lot of time cleaning and organizing. But what the officers witnessed when they stepped inside was the exact opposite. There was broken glass from wine bottles, there was soil from potted plants, there were books all over the place, and furniture overturned. There was also a laundry basket that was flipped over and a 10-pound dumbbell that was lying in the hall. So it was a clear indication of a violent struggle, but even more obvious was the immense amount of blood that covered the tile flooring. When the officers opened the door completely, they saw Annalisa's body collapsed in a pool of her own blood just a few feet from the door. Right away, they knew she was dead. There was a dumbbell laying next to her body, and her hair was on the dumbbell, and there was massive amounts of blood on the floor and her clothes. Annalisa was sprawled out on the floor with one leg leaning on a box, bleeding profusely from her head and face. Her hair was in a bloody, matted mess around her head, and some of it was stuck in the white tile cemented by her own blood. She had all of her clothes on, which made a sexual assault seem less likely, but the amount of blood spatter and smears indicated that Annalisa really fought for her life. She was bleeding during the fight and afterwards. The blood ended up all over the walls and the floor. Whomever attacked Annalisa was very, very angry. So the crime scene was categorized as overkill. The crime scene needed to be treated with extreme caution, and there was an indescribable amount of minuscule evidence that had to be collected. One of the detectives on the scene said that he will never forget it just because of the amount of blood that was all over the place. It went down the hallway into the back. So because of that, they ended up calling in the state police, because state police has a forensic mobile crime lab that they can just park next to the scene and start processing as soon as he explained that he was Annalisa's boyfriend, they had all kinds of questions. So the police wanted to talk to him, and they found this kind of common room at the back of the condo complex, and it's there that they spoke to him, and they noticed right away his affect and character. They told him that his fiancée is dead, and Nelson, he didn't act in the way that people normally do when hearing news like that. He didn't look shocked, he didn't look surprised, he didn't break down and cry, and he didn't even ask any questions. While the detectives were talking to Nelson, one of them noticed a cut on Nelson. And of course, the boyfriend or the husband is always the first person police look at after a murder. So he is now considered a person of interest. However, they don't want him too close to the crime scene, but they want to be able to keep an eye on his behavior and to be able to question him if they need to. Nelson's clothes, it did not have any blood on it at all, on any of his clothes, and but police were thinking, well, that's not really an indication of him being innocent, because he could have just changed. Nelson had quite a few different versions of that morning, and I'm about to explain them to you right now, but it's not very, very long, I promise. It's not very complicated. So, in one version, he and Annalisa had sex that morning, and he took a shower and he went to work. In another version, he and Annalisa had sex. They took a shower together and then he went to work. His third version had them having sex, Nelson and she taking a shower together, then Annalisa sitting on her bed knitting, and Nelson going to work. And then the fourth version had them having sex, them taking a shower together, Annalisa sitting on her bed in a towel knitting, and Nelson playing guitar, writing down some lyrics, and then leaving for work. He said that he drove to the Donut Delight drive-thru a little after 9 in the morning, and he arrived at work shortly after that, and he remained there until a little after 5 p.m. when he returned to Annalisa's residence. So, the night that this all happened, and the morning that he's talking about, this was a Friday, and so Annalisa had just begun a new job. She was no longer working for Purdue Pharma. She started with a different pharmaceutical company called Pharmacia, and she had arranged to work from home on Fridays. Nelson explained that he kissed her goodbye and he took off to that donut shop down the road before he started work. He said that he pulled into the Purdue Pharma parking lot and he got out. He scanned his key card and he entered his office. He then made his way up to the 7th floor. The key cards that are issued to each employee, those key cards track every single person's movement rooms inside the building keep a record of movements. So Nelson claimed that he attended a lecture downstairs during lunchtime and that he grabbed some food from the cafeteria and then went back up to his desk. He says that in the afternoon he remembers hearing his desk phone ring a couple of times, and it was the number for Annalisa's condo, but he said that he didn't have a chance to answer before it stopped ringing, and that Annalisa did not leave a voicemail, so he figured it was probably just an accident that she called, and if she needed something that she would just call back. So he explained that he went about his day as he normally does, and then he drove to meet with Annalisa so they could go out to dinner with their colleagues, remember? So that's when he pulled into the parking lot of Annalisa's condo and was blindsided by all of the police. So the police are looking at Nelson with the cut on his hand and the way he reacted to the news as a definite suspect. So if you remember my telling you that police had taken Nelson to a common room to question him, well, remember, they didn't want Nelson to leave, so they ended up leaving Nelson in that room for over an hour by himself, but they put an officer outside of the door. When the police went back about an hour after they first talked to him again, Nelson was sleeping. So, not a usual reaction, which only made the police feel like he was even more suspicious. When the state medical examiner finally got a chance to inspect Annalisa's body, there were a number of injuries that she had. She had been bludgeoned over the head multiple times. She endured 9 stab wounds to the face, left cheek, neck, and shoulder area. There was a puncture wound behind her ear, a laceration in the back of her head. But the injury that ended her life was a stab wound to the chest. It not only punctured her lung, but it went in so deep that it sliced her pulmonary artery and her rear rib cage. There was no sign of forced entry, so the person who attacked her must have been someone she knew or someone she was comfortable with. The stab wounds were all to the front of Annalisa's body, which confirmed that this was not a case of someone sneaking into the condo and attacking her from behind. This person was someone she must have known who, fought with her and ended her life. She was hit with objects in her own home. It was her own dumbbell that was used against her that was being smashed into her skull. The entire fight, it spanned across the entire home with blood drenching surfaces in multiple rooms and down the hall all the way down to the bathroom. information that the police didn't have yet. Nelson was having an affair, and maybe even with more than one person. So, police began to break down the crime scene. They were putting together pieces from statements that they got from Nelson and other witnesses. Their next task was to find the person who made that 911 call. That call came in from a restaurant called the Duchess Restaurant, which is about 1/2 of a mile down the street from where Annalisa lived. The caller had used a payphone and did not offer a name when they were talking to dispatch. All they said was that they were a neighbor of Annalisa's. The police tried to track down the caller by speaking with Annalisa's neighbors, and that's because the caller claimed to be a neighbor, so that was the most logical place to start. Everybody they spoke to denied calling the police and denied hearing anything odd coming from Annalisa's apartment that day. So now the case slows down over the next few months, and investigators were still trying to look at every possible avenue. They were thinking maybe the person who murdered Annalisa did in fact know her, and that they knew that she worked at Purdue Pharma, and maybe they thought for some reason that she had drugs in her condo, and it was a robbery that just went bad. They thought too maybe it was related to sexual harassment allegations from a previous job, or maybe it was a past boyfriend. Even maybe Nelson hired someone to kill Annalisa. But whatever the case, it was clear that Nelson did not kill her. His alibi actually checked out, even despite his odd behavior, but that didn't mean that he wasn't involved in some way. Purdue Pharma's card swiping system and armed guards proved that he had not left the building all day. He actually did arrive at the office exactly when he said he did, and left to go straight to Annalisa's condo after work. Stamford police had a good idea when the murder took place because they have a 911 call, and because the police show up pretty quickly after that 911 call, they know that a murder took place between noon and 3. So they begin to go back and look at Nelson Sessler's life for that period of time. What they end up finding out is that Purdue Pharma is like a fortress. So to get in and out of Purdue Pharma, you need to go through several different security measures. While you're in the building knows you're in the building. That's terrifying. So they quickly rule him out, knowing that he never left work. He showed up in the morning, and he did not leave work grounds until he got out of work at 5 o'clock, which means that he could not have committed the murder, but jump back to Sheila Davalloo for a bit. Now, remember that the detective found Nelson's phone number that was coming up many times on Sheila's mobile phone that day and evening. Okay, so this is when they found out, investigators and police, that Nelson knew Sheila. The investigator asked Nelson about the phone calls to and from Sheila that were showing up on her phone. And Nelson told them that he knew Sheila. He told them that the same night that they are asking him about, the night of the phone calls, that Sheila had called him and invited him over for dinner, and he went. So after some pressure from investigators, Nelson finally tells them that he had been seeing Sheila, in other words, cheating on Annalisa, for quite some time. So now it's at that time that the police are now looking at Sheila as a person of interest for murdering Annalisa. They now had a motive. They also knew that she was familiar with Annalisa because all three of them had worked at Purdue Pharma at one time, all together. And they also knew that Sheila was capable of violence given the circumstances under which they became aware of her, connecting her to everything. So what they were going to do was to trap Sheila by charging her with attempted murder of her husband, so she would be in custody while they began to build the murder case of Annalisa around her. So Sheila was found guilty and convicted of the attempted murder of Paul. So now that she was in prison, they knew where she was and they could go after her. So once they have Sheila's name, everything else fell into place, and that's because they took that interview that Detective Allison Carpentier did with Sheila, and they matched it up against the 911 call. They now know for certain that Sheila called 911 because they got a voice analysis done, and the voice is no doubt Sheila. Investigators also found proof that Sheila had left work that day, and also because she had left work at noon and returned at 3, and forensics came back, and a spot of blood that was in the sink of the bathroom in Annalisa's condo belonged to Sheila. So what Sheila did was Sheila drove to Annalisa's condo on her lunch break, knowing that Nelson was at work. And when Annalisa answered the door, Sheila went inside and ambushed her. She hit Annalisa over the head with a dumbbell, and she stabbed her over and over and over again with a kitchen knife. And then Sheila quickly left the scene of the crime and went to the Duchess restaurant down the street and called 911. So finally the 911 caller was no longer a mystery. Investigators listened to that call over and over again because lover. Sheila was not the one that Nelson wanted to marry. So Sheila was the girl that Nelson kept on the back burner when he wanted to basically have sex. But the problem with that is that Sheila fell in love with Nelson, and she was absolutely obsessed with the idea of being with him. But that was never in the plans for Nelson, because he was going to marry Annalisa. Later on, they end up reading a letter that Sheila wrote to Nelson, and I'm about to read that. It's not long at all, it's only an excerpt, and it's in the middle, and the reason why is it gives you a little bit of an idea of, her kooky mind. So it says, "Anyway, one of the reasons I wanted to see you one last time was to get some closure, but you ran away from me as if I'm a hunter and you're scared. Here I was, so sad. Instead, I have to get the closure through this letter and grieve without any final words to you. I also want to say that I think it's sad how you toss people away when you no longer have any use for them. You were more than a lover or a partner. You were like a brother I never had. I lost my brother to his illness years ago, and it feels like I lost him all over again. Ultimately, all I wanted more than passion was your friendship, but I don't think you're capable of having a non-sexual relationship with a woman. Anyway, I'm leaving my parents' phone number, so if one day you want to accept my hand in friendship, you can look me up. Love always, Sheila." I find it so interesting that she says that bit about how Nelson just tosses people away because Sheila just kills them. So another thing I found out after the fact was that Sheila and Nelson had begun sleeping together again very shortly after Annalisa was murdered. So Sheila received a 50-year prison sentence, and it was a punishment that effectively keeps her behind bars for the rest of her life. Her total sentence ends in 2079. She must finish the remainder of a 25-year prison sentence in New York State for the attempted murder of Paul in 2003 before she begins serving jail time in Connecticut for Annalisa's homicide. So the judge handed down the 50-year prison term during a sentencing hearing after listening to pleas for the 60-year maximum from Annalisa's parents. The judge described the murder as cold and calculated, and he imposed his sentence, and he invoked religious images referring to the circles of hell from Dante's Inferno. I think it's important sometimes to see if you can get an idea of where the jurors' minds were at the time. I couldn't really find too much, but I did find a juror named Kelly Fado, and I feel comfortable saying what she said because she went on record. So she lived in Greenwich, and she obviously served on the jury. It was a 12-person jury, and they only deliberated for a day and a half following closing arguments, and they came back with was not something taken lightly by anyone. Lastly, Paul Christos put a period to this case as far as Sheila goes and says, Sheila lives in her own shade of reality. I think that perfectly sums that up. Okay guys, that's it. I hope that you enjoyed this story. I always sound like such a psychopath when I say that, but if you're a true crimer, then you understand that meaning. Thank you all for listening. I appreciate every single one of you. I do try very, very